world did not move from war to peace. It moved from war to pressure. When the guns fell silent in 1945, many believed the worst chapter in human history had finally closed. What they did not realize was that the war had not ended. It had transformed. The violence stopped, but the logic of conflict remained, embedded into every decision, every alliance, and every technological breakthrough that followed. This new conflict did not begin with an invasion or a declaration. It began quietly in meetings, documents, and calculations. Former allies began to measure one another not as partners, but as future threats. Trust evaporated quickly, replaced by suspicion structured into policy. The next war would not be fought with armies advancing across borders. It would be fought with influence, production, intelligence, and fear. The shock of this transition was subtle but profound. Populations exhausted by total war expected stability. Instead, they entered a world where peace felt provisional, where preparedness replaced celebration, where every reconstruction effort doubled as a strategic move. The war had ended, but security now meant something different. The Cold War did not announce itself. It revealed itself through patterns. Military demobilization slowed. Intelligence agencies expanded. Research funding shifted from repair to dominance. Weapons were not discarded, they were refined. The absence of open conflict did not signal trust. It signaled restraint under constant calculation. What made this new era especially dangerous was its permanence. Unlike conventional war, it had no clear endpoint. Victory could not be declared without catastrophe. Defeat could not be admitted without collapse. The conflict existed in a state of managed tension, where escalation was feared but preparation was mandatory. For those who had survived the Second World War, this realization was deeply unsettling. They had endured destruction believing it would buy peace. Instead, it bought time. Time to reorganize, rearm, and redefine the rules of power. The battlefield moved from cities to systems, from soldiers to structures. This was the true beginning of the Cold War. Not as ideology alone, but as an environment. A world where war was no longer an event, but a condition. And once that condition was established, there was no easy way back. What followed was not chaos, but structure. The post-war world reorganized itself around a single assumption: that conflict had not disappeared, only changed form. Every major decision taken in the late 1940s carried this assumption beneath the surface. Alliances were not built for cooperation alone, but for balance. Aid was not offered purely for recovery, but for alignment. Reconstruction became inseparable from strategy. Former allies began drawing invisible lines. These lines did not exist on maps at first, but they shaped policy more powerfully than borders ever had. Influence was measured quietly. Intentions were questioned constantly. The absence of open hostility was not interpreted as peace, but as preparation. Each side assumed the other was doing the same. This mutual suspicion hardened quickly. Intelligence gathering expanded at an unprecedented scale. Surveillance replaced scouting. Analysts replaced generals. Information became a weapon as decisive as any army. Knowing the intentions of the other side mattered more than confronting them directly. Uncertainty was dangerous. Certainty was power. Technology accelerated this transformation. Wartime research did not slow down. It intensified. Scientific progress that had once been justified by survival was now justified by deterrence. Weapons grew more complex, more destructive, and less likely to be used. Their purpose was not action, but prevention. Strength was measured not by victory, but by the ability to make war unthinkable. This shift created a new psychological landscape. Populations lived under the promise of peace and the expectation of catastrophe simultaneously. Daily life resumed, but with an undercurrent of tension. Preparedness drills replaced air raid sirens. Shelters remained even as cities were rebuilt. The memory of total war made the possibility of another conflict feel immediate, even in silence. Political leadership adapted to this environment cautiously. Decisions were framed to avoid escalation, but never to invite weakness. Every concession was weighed against perception. Every public statement was calibrated. The Cold War demanded discipline, patience, and constant vigilance. It rewarded stability over heroism and endurance over initiative. For many, this was a difficult adjustment. The clarity of wartime struggle had given way to ambiguity. There were no fronts to advance, no victories to celebrate. Progress was invisible, measured in avoided disasters rather than achieved goals. The war was being fought, but it could not be seen. This invisibility made the conflict more pervasive, not less. It entered institutions, education, industry, and culture. Loyalty was tested quietly. Ideology became identity. The Cold War did not mobilize societies temporarily. It reshaped them permanently. And as this new order settled in, one truth became unavoidable. The world had traded the certainty of open war for the uncertainty of permanent tension. The fighting had stopped, but the pressure never did. As this permanent tension took hold, the nature of power itself began to change. Victory was no longer defined by territory captured or armies destroyed. It was defined by stability maintained and crises avoided. The most successful actions were the ones that never appeared in headlines. Silence became a strategic outcome. This altered how nations measured success. Economic growth became a weapon. Industrial capacity became deterrence. Education, research, and innovation were no longer domestic priorities alone. They were strategic necessities. The battlefield expanded into laboratories, universities, and factories. Competition was constant even when invisible. The Cold War rewarded systems that could sustain pressure indefinitely. Short-term mobilization mattered less than long-term resilience. Governments invested in structures designed not for decisive confrontation, but for endurance. Planning horizons extended decades into the future. The expectation was not resolution, but continuity. This continuity required control over narratives as much as resources. Ideology was no longer an abstract belief system. It became a framework through which societies interpreted reality. Competing visions of order shaped media, culture, and education. Loyalty was cultivated subtly. Doubt was treated as vulnerability. For ordinary people, this translated into a life lived between reassurance and warning. Prosperity expanded in some regions, while fear remained omnipresent. The promise of stability coexisted with the knowledge that it depended on restraint rather than trust. Peace was maintained not because conflict was resolved, but because escalation carried unacceptable consequences. This balance was fragile. Crises erupted periodically, testing limits without crossing them. Each confrontation followed the same pattern. Tension rose, signals were exchanged, and escalation stopped just short of catastrophe. These moments reinforced the central lesson of the Cold War, that survival depended on discipline, communication, and restraint under pressure. What made this era unique was its duration. Unlike previous conflicts, it did not burn out quickly. It settled in. Entire generations grew up knowing nothing else. The Cold War was not an interruption of normal life. It became normal life. As a result, societies adapted in subtle ways. Risk tolerance changed. Innovation focused on control and prediction. Uncertainty was managed through redundancy. The goal was not to eliminate danger, but to contain it. The world learned to live inside a system designed to prevent its own collapse. This was the true legacy of the post-war transformation. The Second World War ended one era of conflict, but it inaugurated another, quieter, longer, and in many ways more demanding. The Cold War required patience instead of bravery, calculation instead of courage, and consistency instead of dramatic action. And once those traits became embedded into global systems, the conflict no longer needed to be declared. It simply continued. As this environment normalized, fear became institutional rather than emotional. It was no longer driven by panic or shock, but by planning. Governments did not react to danger. They anticipated it. Entire bureaucracies existed to imagine worst-case scenarios and ensure they never occurred. The Cold War was managed through preparation, not confrontation. This preparation reshaped daily life in ways that often went unnoticed. Civil defense programs expanded quietly. Infrastructure was designed with redundancy in mind. Communication networks prioritized survivability over efficiency. The goal was not comfort but continuity. Every system had to function even after disruption, because disruption was no longer hypothetical. Military doctrine evolved accordingly. Direct conflict between major powers was treated as failure rather than objective. War plans focused on deterrence, escalation control, and damage limitation. Strength was measured by restraint. The most powerful weapons ever created existed primarily to ensure they would never be used. This paradox defined the era. Peace depended on the credible threat of destruction. Stability rested on the knowledge that escalation would be catastrophic for all involved. This understanding produced a tense equilibrium, where miscalculation became the greatest danger. Precision in communication mattered as much as firepower. Technology intensified both risk and control. Early warning systems, surveillance networks, and command and control structures expanded rapidly. The ability to detect threats in minutes rather than hours became critical. Speed mattered, but accuracy mattered more. A false alarm could be as dangerous as a real attack. These pressures extended beyond military spheres. Political decisions were filtered through strategic consequence. Economic policy, energy supply, and scientific research were evaluated not only for benefit, but for vulnerability. Dependence became a liability. Autonomy became relative rather than absolute. For individuals, this translated into a background awareness of fragility. Life continued, prosperity grew, culture flourished, but always under the shadow of potential collapse. The Cold War did not dominate every conversation, but it shaped the boundaries within which all conversations occurred. This long-term tension altered how societies understood risk. Catastrophe was no longer rare. It was permanently possible. Managing that possibility required discipline, predictability, and trust in systems rather than impulse. Emotional reactions were dangerous. Stability demanded control. Over time, this discipline became habitual. What once felt unnatural became routine. Preparedness drills, security protocols, and strategic caution blended into normal governance. The world learned to operate within limits imposed by its own destructive capacity. This adaptation did not eliminate fear. It organized it. Fear became a planning variable rather than a reaction, and in doing so, the Cold War transformed from a temporary standoff into a permanent condition, one that defined the second half of the 20th century. As decades passed, the Cold War began to reshape not only policy, but perception. The constant pressure altered how people understood time, progress, and threat. History no longer moved in dramatic bursts of war and peace. It unfolded in prolonged tension, punctuated by crises that stopped just short of disaster. The absence of catastrophe became the measure of success. This prolonged restraint produced a strange psychological effect. Societies learned to live with danger without confronting it directly. Anxiety became normalized. Preparation replaced expectation. The future was imagined not as a destination, but as something to be managed carefully, one decision at a time. Stability was no longer something achieved. It was something maintained. Power during this era depended heavily on credibility. Words mattered as much as actions. Signals were analyzed obsessively. Ambiguity could be useful, but only within controlled limits. Too much clarity invited challenge. Too much uncertainty invited panic. The balance was delicate, and maintaining it required constant adjustment. This emphasis on perception extended into global politics. Smaller conflicts became proxy struggles, carefully limited to avoid escalation. Support was offered indirectly. Responsibility was obscured deliberately. The goal was influence without confrontation, pressure without collapse. Violence persisted, but it was managed, localized, and often denied. For populations living within the system, the Cold War shaped identity subtly. Education emphasized vigilance. Culture reflected anxiety and control. Innovation was celebrated, but also feared. Scientific progress promised improvement while threatening annihilation. Optimism and dread coexisted uneasily. This coexistence demanded compartmentalization. People learned to plan ordinary lives, careers, families, futures, alongside the possibility of sudden destruction. The contradiction was rarely resolved. It was simply endured. Normal life continued not because danger disappeared, but because confronting it constantly was impossible. Governments relied on this adaptation. Public resilience became a strategic asset. Calm was encouraged. Panic was discouraged. The greatest risk to stability was not aggression alone, but loss of confidence in systems designed to prevent catastrophe. Trust in institutions became as important as deterrence itself. Over time, this trust was tested repeatedly. Crises revealed weaknesses. Near misses exposed vulnerability. Yet each avoided catastrophe reinforced belief in the system. The Cold War sustained itself through survival. Each year without disaster justified the methods that produced it. This self-reinforcing logic made the conflict durable. Ending it required more than treaties or declarations. It required dismantling assumptions that had structured global life for generations. Fear had become embedded. Removing it without replacing it with something equally stabilizing proved difficult. As a result, the Cold War did not feel like an era waiting to end. It felt like a condition to be managed indefinitely, and that expectation shaped decisions long before its formal conclusion. As this condition persisted, the Cold War began to shape expectations about the future itself. Progress was no longer imagined as freedom from conflict, but as the ability to manage it more effectively. Stability meant avoiding collapse, not achieving harmony. The horizon of ambition narrowed, focusing on control rather than resolution. This mindset influenced how leaders approached change. Reform was cautious. Innovation was measured. Sudden shifts were viewed as dangerous because they risked upsetting carefully maintained balances. The world learned to fear disruption more than stagnation. Continuity became a virtue, even when it preserved inequities and tension. At the same time, the systems built to manage this tension grew increasingly complex. Layers of bureaucracy, intelligence, and coordination accumulated over decades. Each layer was designed to reduce risk, yet together they created opacity. Decision-making became slower, more deliberate, and often detached from public understanding. Authority was exercised quietly, through process rather than proclamation. For ordinary citizens, this complexity reinforced distance from power. Decisions that shaped global security occurred far beyond public view. The Cold War was present everywhere in consequence, but nowhere in experience. This separation made participation difficult and accountability abstract. Trust in institutions became a matter of necessity rather than choice. Technology continued to deepen this divide. Automation, surveillance, and communication systems expanded dramatically. The ability to monitor, predict, and respond to threats improved, but so did the potential for error. A single misinterpretation carried unprecedented consequences. Precision mattered, but fallibility remained unavoidable. This awareness sustained a culture of caution. Escalation was avoided not because it was impossible, but because its cost was immeasurable. Every crisis reinforced the same lesson. Restraint was the only rational strategy. The Cold War rewarded those who could tolerate ambiguity and delay decisive action indefinitely. Yet beneath this discipline lay fatigue. Generations had grown accustomed to living under pressure they did not choose. The promise that the conflict would eventually resolve faded. The Cold War became less a struggle to be won and more a reality to be endured. Hope shifted from victory to survival. This fatigue did not produce rebellion. It produced normalization. The extraordinary became ordinary. The possibility of catastrophe became background noise. Life continued, not because danger diminished, but because adapting to danger became unavoidable. By this stage, the Cold War had achieved its most paradoxical outcome. It prevented the war everyone feared, but it also reshaped the world around that fear. The absence of catastrophe came at the cost of constant vigilance. Peace existed, but it was conditional and fragile, and as long as that condition remained, the conflict did not need to be fought openly. It only needed to be maintained. When the Cold War finally reached its formal end, it did not collapse in flames or triumph. It faded. The systems that had sustained it for decades loosened gradually, revealing something unexpected beneath the tension: exhaustion. The conflict had not been resolved so much as outlived. What remained was a world shaped profoundly by a war that had never been fully fought. This ending felt strange precisely because the Cold War had never behaved like a traditional conflict. There was no final battle to mark its conclusion, no clear moment of victory or defeat. Instead, its legacy was embedded in institutions, habits, and assumptions that had governed global life for nearly half a century. The war ended, but the structures it created did not disappear overnight. Generations had been raised within its logic. They had learned to equate stability with restraint, security with preparation, and peace with vigilance. Even as the ideological confrontation receded, these lessons remained. The world did not suddenly become less dangerous. It became differently dangerous, carrying forward the imprint of decades spent managing catastrophe rather than preventing conflict entirely. For many, the true realization came later. The Cold War had not merely delayed another global war, it had redefined how power, fear, and responsibility were understood. It taught societies to rely on systems rather than individuals, on processes rather than passions. It replaced moments of heroism with routines of control, and in doing so, it reshaped the modern world more deeply than any single battle ever could. The conflict also left behind a paradox. It demonstrated that humanity could avoid its own destruction through discipline and structure, but it also revealed the cost of living indefinitely under that threat. Peace was preserved, but it was never complete. Freedom expanded, but always within boundaries defined by fear of escalation. This is why the Cold War cannot be remembered simply as a period between wars. It was an era that transformed the meaning of war itself. Conflict became permanent, but restrained, invisible, but omnipresent. The world learned to function under pressure so constant that it became normal. In the end, the Cold War did not conclude with relief. It concluded with adaptation. The world moved forward carrying the habits it had learned, the systems it had built, and the assumptions it could no longer abandon easily. The silence that followed was not the silence of peace, but the quiet of a world accustomed to listening for danger. This is the legacy of the Cold War. Not a war that ended, but a condition that taught humanity how to survive its own power. And that lesson continues to shape the world today.